Thank you, Tommy. Mics are on. I'll read so I don't miss any of the notes that I have for to kick us off tonight, but I will be very brief. I see Annalee is also online. Hey. Good evening or afternoon, everyone. We also just found out that we don't know how many people are online, but I think there's a few of friends and past fellows joining us online, so good afternoon to those that are joining us online as well. I hope you all get comfy, and a warm welcome to us joining us online. Thank you for tuning in. We're happy to host you all. I'm Federica. I work in the research department, and amongst other things, I co-coordinate the Tilting Axis Fellowship with Joyce, who's not able to be here with us tonight, at Nieuwe Instituut since 2021. For those of you who are new to the building, I don't know, how many of you have been here before? Okay. Colleagues are like, but also some new faces, which is always nice. We're on the 6th floor, as you might have seen as you were making your way up, of Nieuwe Instituut, the National Museum for Architecture, Design and Digital Culture. During the day, you usually can find colleagues running back and forth between meetings right here, getting through the high pace of the work days. So it's really nice to be able to activate the space tonight at a bit of a slower pace with all of you. This evening is hosted in collaboration with Tilting Axis, so just a few words on that. As mentioned, our Tilting Axis partner Annalee Davis is joining us online, and she will share more on the fellowship after my brief introduction. But very briefly, Tilting Axis as a fellowship program aims to foster and support research-based practices and stimulate mutual exchange between the Caribbean region and the Dutch cultural field. The fellowship is hosted in collaboration between us at Nieuwe Instituut, Tilting Axis based in Barbados, Amsterdam Museum, De Apel, Stedelijk, and Kunstinstituut Melli, our neighbors here in Rotterdam. And this year we've had the pleasure of hosting our 5th Tilting Axis fellow, Amanda McIntyre. Tonight she will share more on her project, Present Continuous, which explores Caribbean architectural and sartorial cultures towards developing a sustainable practices of archiving contemporary Caribbean masquerade. And I will leave it at that because more will be shared later on. And in conversation with Amanda, we're really lucky to have Quincy Gario. Quincy is a performance poet sitting just there, an artist from Curaçao and St. Martin, known for his decolonial work, especially Zwart Piet is Racisme, a member of the Family Connection Collective, co-founded with his mother in 2005. He explores themes of resistance, recovery, and refusal. Their work on the 1983 Antilles Carnival is part of the Dart State Art Collection. Quincy has received multiple awards and has exhibited widely. He's currently a PhD candidate in the Pressing Matter project, researching Dutch Afro-Caribbean artists and colonial heritage. And I had to summarize that because there's a lot more to say about Quincy and Amanda as well. So I hope it will come out in the Q&A between the two of them. And before I pass the mic on to Annalee, to share more about Tilting Axis and the fellowship and where it really initiated from, I just want to take a moment to thank Dan, our producer for tonight, and thank you, Tommy, for the tech support. That's all. I think maybe a housekeeping note, the event is photographed. If anyone doesn't want their photos to be online, just come find me at the end. It's also live streamed and recorded, so in case you want anything out, you can always talk to me. And with that, Annalee, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Federica. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. It's a pleasure to be sharing this moment with you all. Welcome to everyone and to my Caribbean people who are joining us remotely. My task this evening is to share some information about Tilting Axis. And since there may be some people experiencing this for the first time, I thought it would be useful to establish a context for this forum and to share a few introductory remarks about Amanda's fellowship. My colleague Holly Bino and I co-founded Tilting Axis in 2014, working very closely with an international core team to co-design and co-deliver a series of annual convenings with partner host institutions from 2015 to 2019. These took place in Barbados, Miami, the Cayman Islands, the Dominican Republic, and Guadeloupe. Tilting Axis is an informal art platform for, from, across, and through the Caribbean that rethinks the position and conditions of contemporary art practice in our region. Its perspective has been informed by artist-led initiatives within the archipelago, and it recognizes the Caribbean as central and not peripheral. Through its fellowship program, Tilting Axis has supported in total 8 Caribbean contemporary art practitioners, serving as a catalyst for creative projects and collaborations, such as this multi-year alliance with Nieuwe Instituut and our partners in the Netherlands, De Appel, the Stedelijk, Instituut Melly, and Amsterdam Museum, and previously with other partners in Scotland and in the United States. Exchanges of this nature are vital for cultural workers who have chosen to remain in or return to the Caribbean, where in most of the islands, degrees at the master's level do not exist. These fellowships function as additional pathways to knowledge, expertise, archives, networks, and further opportunities for the many beautiful and curious minds that we work with. But why the name Tilting Axis? What does it mean to tilt the axis from our position in the belly of the Americas? As a verb, tilting is a call to action. We're here to do something, and I think Amanda's going to speak about that kind of action in her work this evening. An axis refers to a central part in a structure to which other parts are connected like a hinge. The Caribbean, therefore, is an archipelagic hinge, centrally located in the Americas and a historical crossroad connected to many parts of the world. An axis is also an agreement or an alliance between 2 or more countries that forms a center for an eventual larger grouping of nations. Taken together, Tilting Axis has been a series of roving meetings and fellowship encounters, pivoting on a Caribbean axis from which all other coordinates are viewed, understood, and measured, facilitating more and more alliances. It works to foster a tighter art community across linguistic divisions in the region, with the global majority on both sides of the Atlantic, while bolstering professional relationships and future collaborations. The gaze of the contemporary art world is increasingly shifting by degrees to the global majority, including the Caribbean. And contributing to this shifting gaze is the work of our fellows, including Amanda McIntyre, a PhD candidate at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus in Trinidad and Tobago, who this evening will share 2 short films and invite us to think critically about motherhood, gender roles, domesticity, 19th century Caribbean and contemporary Caribbean baby doll masquerade, and vernacular gingerbread architecture through the lens of her distinctly unique baby doll mass. Through her timely research, Amanda inverts inherited notions of ridicule, abandonment, and destitution inherent in earlier baby doll masquerade. She does this through her inventive use of textiles, architecture, and African-inspired fretwork, escorting us across centuries through a time warp, advocating for another vision that centers the perspective of the mother more humanely, purposefully, and gracefully. On behalf of Tilting Axis, I would like to express profound gratitude to the entire Nieuwe Instituut team for their immense generosity in hosting this evening's event, and indeed for hosting Amanda with such care, for taking care of our partnership with such grace and efficiency. And especially I'd like to acknowledge Federica and Joyce, with whom I've had the pleasure to work so closely over the past 6 years. Finally, I'm thrilled to learn more about Amanda's research this evening during her fellowship with us, and delighted that we have Quincy to join as Amanda's co-discussant after her presentation. I will now hand the floor back to my colleague Dan, who will screen the Dolly Mass footage, after which we will pass the mic to Amanda for her presentation. Thank you so much and have a good evening.
May your heart find peace anywhere you come from. Coulda up, you coulda down, blessings on my nation.
Thank you for joining me. It is my pleasure to welcome you here in person and to also welcome everyone joining via the live stream. Big up to the Caribbean family at home and abroad. Before I proceed, I just want to clarify I'm not yet a PhD student, still at master's level, but one day for sure. I first introduced architectural elements to my contemporary Caribbean baby doll masquerade designs in 2022. At that time, I was musing on the relationship between the body and the home, with the body as the first house of the child. It was this reflection on maternity and interiority that led to ruminations on the relationship between Caribbean women and the image of the house. There is a phrase I grew up hearing that went, "You're good for house," or "you're good to get put in house," which was said to young women who were thought of as being good enough to be married well. It meant that they could keep a house by attending to all its domesticities. The phrase also had a colonial interpretation. It suggested that an enslaved woman had enough manners, respectability, deportment, and skills to serve in the master's house. This symbol of the house was therefore closely related to ownership and the question of who owned the woman either through marriage or enslavement. To attend to the violence of this suggestion, I kept a close reading of the words of Audre Lorde. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support. But is it possible to bring about individual and communal change in a system in which you are both oppressed and also the symbol of your oppression? This was the predicament of the women represented in stagings of the baby doll masquerade in the 19th century Caribbean milieu. Young, unmarried Black women were marked as shallow, unthinking, abandoned, and destitute. I was intrigued with how women asserted themselves in such circumstances, how they expressed themselves through their garments with details that showed the retention of ancestral practices, their desires, and their world building of possible futures through the inclusion of specific colors and symbols interpreted through their Victorian and Edwardian ensembles. In my attempt to reimagine their processes, I considered and responded to the question posed by Saidiya Hartman. Can beauty provide an antidote to dishonor? Or is the narrative its own gift and its own end? As I continued thinking through Caribbean architectural and sartorial aesthetics, the designs and their related artworks emerged. In this presentation, I will discuss the parallel histories of the contemporary Caribbean baby doll masquerade and Trinidadian vernacular gingerbread architecture, with a focus on what suggestions these offer to how we can respond to our current climate emergency. As part of my presentation, you will see the art film 2 Years in the French West Indies, which visually expresses the ideas of this evening's lecture. The baby doll masquerade emerged in the Caribbean in the late 19th century. The first documentation of the masquerade came from the journalist Lafcadio Hearn, whose seminal text, after which the film is named, 2 Years in the French West Indies, provided the impression of the masquerade as a mother and child. It is this impression that is the focus of the film, that for a long time, nothing much seems to happen. Hearn's account was a performance of destitution and abandonment on a centuries-long loop that goes on without challenge. I wanted to ameliorate this. I wanted to fill in details, make the impression clearer, and restore the beauty that was ravaged from her through systematic shaming. In New Orleans, the masquerade emerged in the early 1900s and later on in the Caribbean as parodies performed mainly by men. Errol Hill gives the masquerade's aesthetic, saying that the costume included a frilled dress, a bonnet, stockings, gloves, and a small doll. The player performed the role of mother, while the doll was presented as the child. Male passers-by were stopped and accused of being the father. The accused could relieve himself of the accusation by paying the masquerader. Thus, while this was a femme performance, it was still a very male-focused masquerade practice. Women were only involved as a point of ridicule and dishonor. Jeff Henry confirms Hill's description of the masquerade as a young black woman and child desperately searching the city while begging for support. However, because this phenomenon was considered a deliberate choice of the women involved, the masquerade received little sympathy. These carnival performances were part of the unofficial chastisements of single black mothers. Henry writes, the baby doll was alone, without a support system, to be pitied or ridiculed. It was often a mixture of scorn, annoyance, and mockery sugar-coated with humor. The film presents a reimagination of the masquerade in response to this long trauma-centered history. In the film, I revised the performance of the masquerade. The house that is featured is Mille Fleurs, which we will discuss later on, and it was built in the vernacular gingerbread architectural style. Rosa de Ochala enters and claims it for herself and her child. The film addresses and challenges the early portrayals of destitution that were presented in stagings of the masquerade by situating the baby doll in a montage of domestic interiority characterized by self-possession and security. In my experiments with Caribbean architectural and sartorial practices, I have focused on the vernacular gingerbread style for its aesthetic, its parallel trajectory to the baby doll masquerade, and for the relationship between its structural integrity and Caribbean weather. Gingerbread architecture emerged in the Caribbean around the same time as the baby doll masquerade. Trinidad vernacular gingerbread architecture, like Caribbean nation languages, responds to the culture, the language, the natural environment, and the climatic conditions of the region. Vernacular architecture is distinguished by its focus on functionality and the use of available materials. The orientations of the features of the constructions are designed with reflections on the tropical climate of the Caribbean. This was not a formal architectural practice and does not involve trained architects. It was instead done out of necessity and involved the skills of local constructors using accessible and, if possible, inexpensive materials. This aesthetic was popular in Trinidad and Tobago, and some of the houses constructed at that time can still be found throughout the country, having survived the turn of the millennium's gentrification patterns. Some are amalgamations of various continental influences, drawing inspiration from existing building traditions and styles within the region. These include French, Iberian, English, and Moroccan details with Caribbean indigenous, African, Chinese, and Indian details as well. The Scottish architect George Brown is often credited with introducing the vernacular gingerbread style to Trinidad, but this is incorrect. He did not introduce the style. Vernacular gingerbread architecture was being practiced in Trinidad long before his arrival, the research shows. Brown codified the aesthetic as a unique typology and then popularized the style among prominent families in Port of Spain. And it was within this circle that the propaganda began about him introducing the style to the island. Gingerbread architecture is characterized by elaborate decorative details, including fretwork, also known as lattice work. Fretwork is both ornamental and functional. It is an intricate lace-like geometrical design rendered in wood. These low-leaf relief carvings are then cut out using a fret saw, scroll saw, or more recently through laser cutting. According to Patricia Green, Caribbean fretwork is rooted in African symbolism, integrating decorative and functional purposes for climatic controls to encourage natural ventilation for thermal comfort and to provide hurricane resilience. She notes that the motifs of Caribbean fretwork were sometimes connected with Ugandan symbols. To appreciate the symbols and meanings of Caribbean fretwork requires an understanding of their rootedness in the continent of Africa. Susan Denya mentions that the ornaments and embellishments on traditional architecture on the continent of Africa were considerable physiological significance, appearing at points of potential stress and high structural stress on buildings, such as on lintels. And in urban settings, Lewis calls the indigenous design of the timber frame ajupa derivative in Trinidad as a gingerbread house with a galvanized iron roof. Sometimes the features worked to facilitate the Caribbean's weather. For example, many gingerbread houses included jalousie windows. These horizontal slats slope downwards and use a crank mechanism to provide light and ventilation to the interior. Gingerbread houses also included demerara windows, which function to cool the home when the wooden box-shaped cooler at the base of the window is filled with cold water or plants to cool the air as it passes into the interior. The roofs of the gingerbread house also contribute to the ventilation of the home as they are steep, thereby accommodating high ceilings, and also contributing to ventilation with the jallies, which are flat wooden surfaces above the doors, which also featured the geometrical patterns similar to fretwork. The vernacular gingerbread architectural style was also usually coupled with wrought iron fences, gates, and banisters that were also designed to reflect the lace-like fretwork, or, in some cases, aesthetically extended the landscaping with floral motifs. The image of the Trinidadian vernacular gingerbread house is one of the Dolimas emblems. I wanted to harmonize the details of this architecture with textiles. My architectural sartorial project began with a costume trousseau that is featured in the film. The costume was made from various laces that mirrored the aesthetics of the gingerbread latticework. I wanted to highlight the non-European distinctions of the fretwork practice in vernacular gingerbread architecture, so I chose specific laces that contained symbols similar to Adinkra and Ghanaian graphics that represent various words, phrases, and proverbs from that culture. The vernacular gingerbread is also an aspect of the Dolimas narratives of time travel, in which the Loreto family moves with their real estate. I named the family Loreto after the time-traveling house in the Roman Catholic mythography. In the designs, the houses are on the heads of the travelers and on their bodies. Houses also rest on stylized parasols. I made the first sketches and final drawings of what I titled Parasoleil in July 2023 while living in China. The design distorts the scale of the traditional Chinese parasol, elongating its shank and trimming the canopy. The main feature of Parasoleil is the vernacular gingerbread miniature at the top and center of the canopy. The question of scale in the Dolimas designs and the interaction of these with the audience that do not question the scale is one of the ways in which architecture is used in Dolimas to further the magical realism of the narratives. Thus, like the 19th century craftspeople who are ratifying the vernacular gingerbread in Trinidad, I also include multiple cultural heritages in my design practice. These architectural and sartorial experiments find harmony in how together they render the performer's relationship to the materials as a palpable, temporal, extended movement that pivots 19th century practices in 21st century frameworks. Here, time does not proceed in linear fashion. It loops, intersects, divides, pauses to take its breath, and is sometimes interrupted. Everything on and surrounding the performer is political advocacy through a conscientious practice of decoloniality in design. And this brings me to the end of my address. I thank you all again, and thanks also to the Nieuwe Instituut and to Tilting Axis for the award of the fellowship and for facilitating a generative residency that I am certain will resonate through my work for the rest of my life. Thanks also to my esteemed colleagues, Annalee Davis, Joyce Hansen, Federica Notari, and Dan Timmer. And my thanks also and a warm welcome to my friend, colleague, and ally, Quincy Gario, who will now join me for the conversation. Thank you.
I have to say, for me, that was a wonderful. It was on mute, so that's what happens. So for those who were seeing me but weren't hearing me, I have to say it was really, really wonderful to hear your text and to see the two videos, and now we're seeing images of your drawings that are also here in a visual display. How long is this visual display going to stay here at Nieuwe Instituut?
I'm not certain. Indefinitely.
Can you tell us a bit about what we're seeing?
Right, so what we're looking at is the interaction of the costume with various architecture in Port of Spain. So I wanted to show especially the elements that I speak about in the lecture. So the middle image there, that is all in sepia, that is a house that is on Norfolk Road in Belmont. Belmont is a suburb of Port of Spain in which you find a lot of the relics of gingerbread architectural style in the urban center, and some of these date back to the late 19th century. And you can see that these are homes that belong to what would have been considered lower middle class people. They are still present there, and I wanted to show, especially as you can see the wrought iron gates, that these are in fact Adinkra symbols. And one of the long tragedies concerning this type of architecture in Trinidad is the assumption that it's related to coloniality. So much of its mixed cultural heritage had been suppressed for such a long time. So in the photographs, I wanted to show that especially, and also show the details of the costumes that also reflect these symbols as well. And so that's why I put together this specific set of images so that the viewer can get a scope of the Dolimas practice, the Dolimas design practice of textile and architecture, and how these two work together. I sometimes say how these two harmonize.
I mean, when we think of carnival, we think of harmonies anyway, right? Mm-hmm. There's all these different things coming together, so I think harmonize is a beautiful word to use there. One of the things which fascinated me to no end was the Loreto house.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit more about that?
I was just so gifted with this story a few years ago. And when I first heard it, it sounded so fantastical. I couldn't imagine that it could possibly be something that was truthfully being told. And so this is an actual part of Roman Catholic law that concerns the house in which the Virgin Mary grew up in. I mean, Roman Catholics have a lot of little known mythologies apart from the general catechism of the church, etc. And so there was this story that is continually told about the house that the Virgin Mary grew up in, and that this house was uprooted from its first establishment in Palestine, and in order to protect it, it had been moved to different parts of the world. So it would literally be like uprooted and then flown through the air and then would be set to rest somewhere else. And this has been taking place since before the birth of Jesus Christ, apparently. And currently it is resting in Italy, and it has been sanctified, like formally sanctified by the Roman Catholic Church as the official house that the Virgin Mary grew up in. And so the particular Marian apparition associated with the house is called the Lady of Loreto. And the various Marian apparitions have different portfolio. Like, it's quite an establishment of Mary's. And so this particular Marian apparition grants mercies, traveling mercies, to anyone who travels by air. And so when I started writing the Dolly Mass narratives with all of these time travelers using either science or magical devices to travel, I wanted to give the family a name. And so with this myth of a time traveling house with a lady associated with it who's giving mercies and graces to time travelers, I thought, perfect, they will be the Loretos. And so here we are.
I think it's really interesting as well in terms of the way in which it speaks to extractivism, but also to the ways in which we can find different values in that extractivism. One of the things which I think a lot of people kind of know but don't really is the way in which masquerade and the way in which the carnival in and of itself is connected to Roman Catholicism and the way in which it came to the Caribbean. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes. Well, Carnival in the Caribbean is a pre-Lenten festival. And so it takes place on the 2 days preceding Ash Wednesday. And Ash Wednesday being the opening of the Easter season. So it's going to culminate with the crucifixion, Good Friday, then followed by Easter Sunday, Easter Monday, and so on and so on. And so, in between the celebration of Easter and Ash Wednesday, there's a period of fasting. And so just before this period of fasting, people want to just get rid of all their fleshly desires. And so Carnival occurs, and Carnival in the French translates to farewell to the flesh. So you bid a farewell to the flesh, and then you go into your Lent. But apart from the positioning of the festival on the calendar, it also came in, well, at least the ways in which we practice Caribbean carnivals came into the Caribbean as a result of French Catholics. And so in that way, it is related, just as I was talking about earlier in the month, it's related to the heritage of missions to the Caribbean as well. And so a lot of what you see in terms of the respectability politics of Carnival is influenced by the church. And a lot of what you see in terms of people trying to turn the world upside down, as Mikhail Bakhtin would say, is also related to the church as well, trying to get away from ideas of what is holy and going towards ideas of what is considered secular. So very closely related in that way.
And I think also in terms of the masquerade as a place of critique,
yes,
as a place of, under the dark of night, being able to say things which could not be said during the day. One of the things which is really, really interesting about Caribbean Carnival as well is the way in which, from what I've seen and understood, is how, the enslaved would see these French in their inner houses celebrating Carnival, and then they would take it outside and then be on the street with it. How has the Dolly Mass performance on the street affected how you approach it?
So much of what takes place on the road at Carnival time becomes a part of our narratives. Like the street, I often say, tells me how to proceed in the next year. One happy experience I have had repeatedly since first founding Dolly Mass in 2020 is not having to explain what is going on with the costumes or what's going on with the performance. People know. So the first year we took Trousseau out, for example, Orisha practitioners were stopping me and asking me if this is related to Obatala in any way. Obatala being chief of the white cloth, and there being a large community of Orisha practitioners in Trinidad, stemming from a practice of Shouter Baptists. You can see the work of Francis and Melville Herskovitz. It's called the Trinidad Village, that discusses this. And as I said in the lecture, the character's name is Rosa de Ochala, which comes from the Brazilian candomblé tradition for any female devotee of Obatala. So with all of this background going into the costume, to get onto the road and to hear people identify it with Obatala is of course immediately good for me. But apart from these other recognitions as well, for example, questions like what century you all come from. And I love this especially not only for the recognition of the particular style references, which are Victorian, Edwardian, and sometimes Rococo and Elizabethan influences as well, but also because the story is telling of these time travelers who are really recently arrived from other centuries. So it's really great always for that type of interaction on the road.
One of the things which I think a lot of people might not really understand is how influential Trinidadian Carnival has been for the whole Caribbean region. Mm-hmm. So there's a way in which, for example, the Dutch Caribbean Carnival has been influenced by a lot of Trinidadians coming to work in the oil refinery, both in Aruba and also on Curacao. Can you tell us a bit how migration works in terms of the diaspora going out and then coming back to see these types of performances and to be part of them?
That's a great question. Well, firstly, in the scholarship, Caribbean carnivals is defined in exactly the way that you've put it, that there are carnivals, of course, throughout the Caribbean, but these all in some way relates, especially since mid-20th century, relates to the Caribbean, to the Trinidadian model, But what I've found to be even more interesting is with Trinidad being positioned for such a long time as the nexus in terms of the definition, the working definition of Caribbean carnivals, is so much of what's in Trinidad is as a result of Caribbean migrations. This masquerade, for example, that I am focusing on came into Trinidad after migrations from Martinique. When Lafcadio Hearn first documented the masquerade, he documented it in Martinique, and that was even before it was ever cited in Trinidad. And even in Trinidad, it did not have a name until the middle of the 20th century. And there are other masquerades in Trinidad with similar histories as well. And those that move outwards, but also speak back to other masquerade practices. For example, one that I have been particularly interested in is Le Mariage Burlesque, practiced in Martinique. And I wonder about the ways in which these masquerades are related to practices of masquerade even outside of Carnival. Like during the Lenten season in Trinidad on Good Friday, there is something we call the Good Friday Boboli, in which you make an effigy of a person, you go down the street with them, and the entire village comes out to beat this effigy. And when I was a child, they said it was somehow related to the legend of Judas Iscariot, and they just want to catch Judas before the crucifixion of Christ. The Caribbean has a lot, right? It's a lot. And so Caribbean migrations, of course, heavily influence what goes on in Trinidad and Tobago, but Caribbean carnivals have been and continue to be defined by the Trinidadian model.
I think you bring up something really interesting there in terms of excess, mm-hmm. And also in terms of there is nothing excessive for us, right?
No.
There's a way in which people come in and see all of these performances, all of these gatherings, and think, ooh, this is a bit too much. And we're like, wait, it's not enough. It can be more.
Exactly.
When thinking about all the references you put into your work, like how exactly do you find a way to translate all of that into all of the work that we see? Because it's a skill to have all of these things and then think, okay, this is the type of lace I'm using, this is the parasol I'm using, this is the construction of the house on the parasol. How does that work? How do you approach?
Well, to make certain that nothing is lost, and I'm not even sure if that's possible, but I make sure to use various media. So, of course, we are on the road at Carnival time. Of course, Dolly Mask now involves not only the design practice and people paying to play in the band, which is what happens in Trinidad and Tobago Carnival, but we have a troupe of trained performers now, including dancers, actors, etc. But beyond being on the road for Carnival, which is very temporal and fleeting, and so much is lost in terms of your intention, we have been keen to render the work through various photographic as well as cinematographic lens. And so throughout the year, this work is continually put forward so that curious eyes could have even closer inspection of the material, because I could sit here and say, okay, so we have our Adinkra symbols, but I want you to have a close photograph like the one you're looking at there, in which you could look at the hands, you could look at the lace on the stockings, you could look at the various lacings along the bodice, for example, and in this way, not only investigate the material, but ratify the information as well. And I have found people who are particularly curious in those ways. And so Dolly Mask tends, since inception, and even more so since I started opening up to the public in 2024, the people who've been most interested in actually being a part of the work have been academics, artists, writers, that type of curious imagination. And so that's the way it goes.
Great. I'm going to look at Dan for a second. Are there any questions from the online audience? Not yet. As I just said, you can chime in if you have anything to add, to reflect on, to question. I can ask questions for days, so that's not an issue. But just so that you know, it's an open conversation. Annalee has a question.
Hi, thank you, Quincy, and that was a beautiful presentation, Amanda. Thank you so much. I have two questions. One is around scholarship, and I know because we've had the conversation, but I thought it would be interesting to share what happens when you go into archives and find unexpected things and how it relates to the Catholic Church in Trinidad. But the other is, it's a really tight presentation, but I want to know what it feels like outside of the mind and the scholarship and the research to produce the baby doll mask. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what it feels like on the street. How does it become different? You're embodying this character, and I'm curious if you could speak about it more from this, like, from your senses. Thank you.
Sorry. Just to jump on, and Annalee and I have had a lot of conversations with Amanda, so but the process and the work that you do is so multifaceted, and there's a longevity to it, from conceptualizing the story and rewriting these stories to then going onto the drawing board, to working with a tailor to make the costumes, working with people. I remember one of the first conversations, you were showing us sketches and you were thinking about making this costume for this particular person and the excitement of that. So maybe I just want to highlight that, because there's so many layers of craft and of intellect, as we've heard, and so was more of a comment question.
Thank you for the questions, Annalee and Federica. Concerning the embodiment of the masquerade, there has been a wide and widening spectrum that ranges from one end, the discomfort with being regarded as destitute and abandoned. And already this was deeply uncomfortable for me from the very start. When I first performed the masquerade in 2011, And, people would be like saying things like, who's your child father, girl? Who's your child father? As if. And so there was like this great discomfort with that early on, and having to work through those feelings with respect to people who either through choice or through circumstance are in such situations. And part of the discomfort that I have had with this masquerade, it's one of the two that I know of. And actually, there will be more, I'm sure, if I look at the research. But masquerades that actually receive money on the road. And so in those early days, and it happened this year as well, not with me, but with someone else working with Dolly Mass, in which people, men especially, would run up to you on the road and try to give you money. So one of my performers got $12 at Adam Smith Square this year. And it's from people, just remember, historically the masquerade was the doll looking for the father of the child, and someone trying to get rid of her will give her this money. So when you're approached with this money, is someone, one, trying to get rid of you, but it's also a sort of entrance into personal space with a suggestion that may be uncomfortable. And so it starts on that end of the spectrum, but then goes over onto a full other end in which the work of Dolly Mass had been primarily to challenge those early projections and perceptions also of the masquerade. And so in trying to channel the baby doll, not through destitution, but through desire, through intention, through possible futures that include hope and include love and include sincerity and include security and, include so many things that the initial impression of the aesthetic was denied, is really a feeling of not just empowerment but also of liberation that I did not anticipate when I first started doing this work intentionally in 2020. And we hear people respond to it on the road. So there is one person in particular in our band this year whom I said, in the narrative, we have the young girl, La Nina, who has to go on a quest through Port of Spain, and she has to bring back 3 items, and we laid out all of the items and the symbolism of these things that she would return with. And then in 2026 is the performance of the chapter, The Woman. But in between those chapters, I still wanted a person to connect the girl with the woman. And so we had what would be the teenager. And people were recognizing her on the road as that and calling her the princess, the carnival princess, and all of these things. And so I know also the way in which the masquerade was previously perceived as, this thing to be scorned and mocked had been transformed in some ways. And we feel it and we see it. And for me, it is also a place of humility. Every time I write or talk about the girl who was once roaming the city, destitute and alone, I feel that. And there is this chapter in Saidiya Hartman's book, Wayward Life's Beautiful Experiments, that begins, she makes an errant path through the city. And when I read that in Hartman's work for the first time, I thought about the masquerade. I thought about all of the girls who did not make it through the 19th century and the 20th century with any type of support at all. And to be in a situation like that and then to have to confront people mocking you in these ways at carnival times. And so it's a deeply emotional, transformative process for me to embody this year after year, but it's also connected with so much positivity as well. And then on a personal note, I feel I could share this because I have written and published about it before. In addition to not having grown up with my own mother and then having had the experience of a miscarriage, that had also become tethered, those feelings also became tethered to my performance of maternity. And so there are many times in which I come out with Dolly Mass and I may choose to not carry a child. And while that is related to my personal trajectory, it's also related to our advocacy concerning maternity, that you are not tethered to your child and that you can create a family in various ways and that you could pursue other things and that there are other people who will take care of you. So that's the first response. It was a long question. So
it was a wonderful response, and thank you for sharing. I saw Annalee in the background there nodding along and was like almost pumping the fist in the air. Yes.
And there was an earlier parted question concerning Roman Catholicism and archives. That has been one of the most inspiring points about the time of the residency in Rotterdam. I did not expect to find the things I found in the archives. As a matter of fact, I can confess, when I first received the correspondence from Federica about getting in touch with the archivist, I knew there would be many interesting things in the Dutch archives. I know that. The Dutch are known for architecture. I would see beautiful things. I would see things that would inspire me. I was certain about that. But I had no clue that I would find the plans to the monastery in Trinidad at which the Capuchin monk first brought the Sapari Mai doll into Trinidad that became La Divina Pastora, that is revered by Trinidad, after which I designed a baby doll performance in 2016, and we have all the photographs. And the plans for that church is right here in this building with us. And then further to that, this particular architect was quite prolific and documented his work, as the Dutch are good at documentation, I must say. And so he wrote articles about it, and then on another day, going to see the archivist again, she had collated various photographs of the same monastery, and among them were images of a school for girls. And I was raised as, you probably know this from everything I've been saying, but I was raised as a Roman Catholic and also went to a Roman Catholic girls' school. And so looking at the photographs, I thought this looks like St. Joseph Convent in Port of Spain. And so we immediately went to Google Maps to check on this, and it was not St. Joseph Convent in Port of Spain, but in this building we have the original plans for St. Joseph Convent, Trinidad and Tobago in San Fernando, the same building. And how does this relate to Dolly Mass? Because this is one of those institutions in which girls learn that respectability. It is these convent schools that I was most apprehensive about approaching when we first started doing the Dolly Mass Carnival Arts workshops, because we thought they would absolutely close their doors to us, because these are the people who, one, not only chastise young women in perhaps even worse ways than the masquerade did, but also have repudiated carnival practices also. And so there was a lot of thinking through various things, like, one, remembering that Trinidad has this long history in which, to go back to your earlier question, Quincy, the masquerade and carnival as a whole is tethered to these Christian missions. But beyond that, to go back to another question, the ways in which all of these are related to migrations, that here we have people from other places coming in and being involved, like that Capuchin priest who came in and then settled in a monastery that was not only designed but constructed by this Dutchman. And here are the plans that happened to be in the Nieuwe Instituut at the time of my residency in 2025. And so it's just wildly interesting material always. And this is why I continue to say I feel the time of this fellowship would just resound through my entire career.
And then there was another question about craft.
Oh yes, Federica.
Right. When you know too much behind the scenes. But I think it's interesting, and we saw it quickly pass by the screen, chapter 2, the coming of age. Maybe you can share on what these chapters stand for. You mentioned it briefly, but
Yes.
yeah, so maybe those two parts and just how you get from idea to story to sketch to
Thank you.
the street.
Well, let me first begin by saying I have a lot of time on my hands. I personally don't know how everything happens because it's the fellowship and school and carnival and a lot of writing in between, as you can imagine, for various things. But the Carnival project has been and continues to be an immensely generative one that surprises even me. I'm usually hesitant to say this, but just like the other points, I published about it recently, so I could say. But ever since I was a small child, I would see these things on television or through film or even read things in books. And these images would literally haunt me. They'll be on my mind all the time. I would see them in dreams. I would often bring them up in conversations. And because of these images that made such an impression on me, I think it is through that my narrative style developed. And so this idea of the child at the center of the narrative was very important to me and became even more important as I got into my own scholarship around queer studies, etc., and how important it is to think of yourself in the future as a queer person, and how important it is to think of queer children in the future as well. And so the coming of age story, which we began telling in Trinidad and Tobago in 2024, really started in 2022 when Dolly Mass did the story of Brigitte. Was the first time traveling narrative that we had, and Brigitte is this woman from the 18th century Trinidad who met Cynthia Davenport, who came into Trinidad via the cedula of population. At that time, Trinidad's population was so low compared to other islands in the Caribbean that they were literally paying people to come into the island. So if you wanted to come in Trinidad for whatever reason, you would receive property, you would receive money, you'd be set up in a job, you'll get a title, and so you could be so dirt poor somewhere else and come into Trinidad and be prominent immediately. And the more people you brought with you, the more you would get. And so people packed up all of their family, all of their belongings, and we know at the time belongings meant other human beings as well. And they just brought everybody across to Trinidad. And Cynthia comes as part of this package of the Laperouse family. And they are set up in Port of Spain as a result. And she coming from the Francophone Caribbean, she has a very amateur practice of voodoo, which she experiments with Brigitte in the Laperouse cemetery that is still located in Port of Spain, and it's very beautiful. So if you're ever there, please make a trip. And it is through these experiments that she unwittingly summons the Haitian voodoo Loa, Mama Brigitte, who opens the portal, and it's through this device that the two of them start time traveling. Now, in 2022, the narrative ends there. The two of them, they've lost each other by the end of Carnival, and the narrative ends with them separate. And I was just troubled by this. I was like, I can't believe I left them lost in space. That is so sad. And so I just always had that in my mind locked there to try to work through it. And when the coming of age and Carnival narrative started, I wanted to do many things. I wanted to tell the history of the baby doll. I wanted to tell the history of Dolly Mass. I wanted to rationalize why Dolly Mass was still around. And so the narrative is about how to keep a masquerade alive. So it is told in 3 parts. The girl, chapter 1, the doll, chapter 2, and the woman, chapter 3. Exactly. And I got these 3 chapters based on a definition of the baby doll masquerade that I gave in one of my early essays, in which I said the masquerade presented a triad representation of Caribbean femininities: the doll, the girl, and the woman. And so in the first chapter, which we played in 2024, La Nina is brought into the world through a spell. Dolima is alone. I'm not saying she's based on anyone we know, but she's alone and she doesn't have a child and she wants a baby so bad. And but she can't have children. And she decides that she would make this spell, and to get to the spell work, I did a lot of reading around voodoo as well as Eastern European practices, like a lot of reading around the legends of Baba Yaga, for example. And so she makes this spell that calls a spirit into the doll, and overnight the doll becomes a real girl. And just as the doll is becoming the girl, is just at the same time Carnival is about to start in Trinidad. So she takes the girl down when they hear the music next morning into Port of Spain. She meets the other masquerades, but by the end of that Carnival 2024, they say, but you haven't been tested, so you can't remain a masquerade. So we're starting to answer the questions of why should Dolly Mask even remain as part of this thing anyway? And so in 2024, our second chapter, The Doll, in the narrative, it gives some of the histories of the magical dolls of Dolima. 2025, this year. In the narrative, it gives some of the histories of the magical dolls of Dolima. In the research I found, in one of the documents, the masquerade, even before Martinique, being connected to an earlier masquerade at the Carnival of Thrace, in which there was also this woman and child being performed during carnivals. And at that time, it was called Mother Babu. And so in the Dolly Mask narratives, it is Mother Babu, when they're making the Great Ocean Crossing, who gives her the gifts of these dolls that she then brings into the Caribbean, and these magical dolls remain. And it's one of these magical dolls that she turns into La Nina. And for La Nina to remain in Carnival, she goes on the quest. And so in the early footage of Dolly Mask 2025 that you looked at, you may have noticed there was a little girl with me. And so her 3 tasks on that Carnival day were to go to different places in Port of Spain. She had to find the oldest news. So she's a smart little La Nina. So she finds easily that it is the printry that is publishing newspapers. And when she goes there, she sees tomorrow's news today. And there was actually the front page story one year of indigenous bones being rediscovered at the seat of government in Trinidad. And I always found that to be such a powerful image that in all these years we've been operating our governance from this place, not knowing that we were on top of indigenous bones. And so she goes, and the second task is to find the oldest bones, which she finds there. And retrieving one of the bones, the third task is to return with the head of Christopher Columbus. And we have for many years had various projects concerning the removal of colonial emblems from around the city, and the statue of Christopher Columbus in Tambrin Square, Port of Spain, has been a site of great contention through all of these protests, etc. And so La Nina, being strong and powerful and discovering along the streets of Port of Spain that she's just as magical as Dolima, she brings back this head, and she's celebrated at the end of Carnival by these masquerades. Now, it seems like we're at the conclusion of the story, of course, but you have to ask, we're in chapter 2, how you mean she returned with all the things already? And I mean, so I will give you the sneak peek into 2026. And please feel free to come join us for Carnival. The story of La Nina and coming of age in Carnival, which we will see in the 3rd year for the chapter The Woman, is the backstory of Brigitte. This is how Brigitte came into the world. This is how Brigitte remained in the world. This is part of how Brigitte went out into Port of Spain, grew up, and became this great girl. And so in 2026, I will then conclude the story of Brigitte by bringing her back again so that she and Cynthia find each other again on a carnival day. And the rest you will see in 2026.
You take it from there. Wow, amazing. So rich. I mean, you were talking and I'm like, wait, it's a movie happening in front of us. Amazing. One of the things which is really, really interesting about your research that you've done here and finding like the St. Joseph plans, I went to St. Joseph School on St. Martin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look at that.
And there's something really interesting as well about touching on the role of the Roman Catholic Church in terms of education. So on St. Martin and on Curaçao, the Dutch planters were Protestants, so they did not want to give education to the enslaved. But then the missionaries could come over and they were able to start education. So on both of the islands and also in the Windward Islands, so Sabo, St. Martin, St. Eustatius, and the Leeward Islands, Curaçao, Aruba, and Bonaire, the Catholic School Board is the biggest school board on those islands.
Wow.
Still to this day. Yeah. So there's something interesting there about respectability, about different types of rituals, about thinking through symbols, and the ways in which architecture and these performances give space to slip in different types of symbols, like the Adinkra symbols you were talking about.
Exactly. There is just so much. Caribbean Carnivals remains one of those treasuries, but as I read also on my time in Rotterdam, just like architecture is really just the entrance, just like the archives is really just the entrance. Your research question, you really only entering from that point. You have no idea of all of what's there, and just like in a lucid dream, all the doors that continue to open up along the walls as you walk along, it's just for us to determine how much of it we want to charter, and how deeply we want to go into those things, but it remains a generative space.
You mentioned the Eastern European influence, and one of the things which was also really striking for me, thinking through like the Dutch history, during the beginning of the 20th century, 1920s, there are a lot of Eastern Europeans coming to Curaçao, for example, fleeing persecution. And so with them, they could also have been bringing all of these stories. Yeah.
Exactly, because what I thought was interesting in reading about Mama Brigitte in the Haitian tradition is that this is a entity that is also revered in Ireland. That the Dutch have a Brigitte or Bridget, whom they revere, and I am so interested in finding what the connections would be. And I'm glad that you bring up Eastern European magic and how it may be present through migrants in the Caribbean, because it's so fascinating that you hear these things all the time, but we never really make the connections, you know? And then sometimes there is a challenge, even now in Carnival, whenever you introduce anything that is new, the purists will show up, but don't interrupt the thing. And then I would have to respond by reminding them, like Chimamanda, the dangers of a single story, the dangers of a meta-narrative, and that we should always be open to the possibilities that there is much more, that there are more connections, wider influences than just the ones we've been trained to think of. And so because of that, I continue to not only practice, but celebrate the practice of multiculturality in design.
Great. I'm looking at Dan. Are there any more questions online? Great.
I have one question from Arnaldo James, who says, "Hi Amanda, thank
Arnaldo.
Thank you for the presentation and congrats again on the fellowship. Following Annalee's question, would you share what you may have learned in your research about the baby doll mass in the diaspora, i.e. outside of Trinidad and Tobago?"
So there is a thriving practice of baby doll in New Orleans. And according to the researcher Kim Vasdeville, this was already established since the early 1900s. And it is distinct from what happens in the Caribbean, in that while in the Caribbean it has been very individual. In some cases in the Caribbean, two performers would play. In Martinique, there would be a doll, and sometimes another person would play the child and would be called in bébé. And then later on, it moved to just being a person with a small doll. But in New Orleans, there are whole groups, whole troops, whole bands of baby dolls that come down. And they rarely ever have the doll. And they function not just as bands that come out at carnival time, but continue throughout the year as organizations, as informal organizations, very much like sororities. So if one of them has a birthday, everyone shows up to the party. If somebody has a christening, everyone will come and they'll bring their gifts. They make their costumes together, and they're really organized in that way. And this was investigated strongly, as I mentioned before, by Kim Vasdeville, who has two books on this practice. One is called The Baby Dolls of New Orleans, and her second book on it is called Walking Ratty. And she just goes deeply into their history, which connects, of course, to the personal histories of this woman, because they're so involved in each other's lives, but then connects strongly to the socio-political history of New Orleans that involves other masquerade practices that very much like what I read today is also heavily influenced by the environment, influenced by their climatic conditions. So I spoke with one baby doll practitioner there who lamented to me about the ways in which various hurricanes have affected the practice and have affected the archiving of their work, etc. And so that Arnaldo is definitely one point outside of the Caribbean that I've delved deeply into.
What's fascinating for me about your research, but also thinking about Trinidad and Tobago, is that I think a lot of people here might not know is that the Dutch were also on Tobago. But not just the Dutch, also the Latvians, right?
The French.
And the French. And they had wars, and they were parts of all of these different struggles. Do you see the baby doll and the masquerade as a means of a centering while all of these European powers are fighting for possession of the bodies?
Good question. Good question. Especially too with how I opened the lecture in terms of especially women's bodies always being interpreted in this capitalist way. I'm glad you mentioned Tobago. There's a little known masquerade in Tobago called the Paper Girl. I'm really interested in the Paper Girl because so little is written about it. And when you look at Caribbean masquerades, Caribbean femme masquerades, they all give like a different position in the woman's life. So you have the baby doll, you have the pissenlit or pissenlit, as many would say, presents menstruation, while the baby doll presents maternity. Then there's the older but more sexually excessive, or sexually presented, I should say, Dame Lorraine. Then there is in Jamaica, which is now Junkanoo in Jamaica is not considered a part of Caribbean carnivals per se, but it contains Caribbean masquerades, and within the cohort of Junkanoo masquerades is one called literally the Girl. And then in Tobago, the Paper Girl. And the Paper Girl looks to me very much again like a Victorian impression, but the costume is made entirely of newspaper clippings. And so there is this connection to everything that's going on. It seems to be like a masquerade that's continually asking and answering the questions of what's going on. And with so much going on in Tobago, historically, I mean, I could definitely see how such a thing could emerge and could be sustained through time, even on a minor scale. even on a minor scale, and then connecting that very easily to the capitalist interpretation of the woman's body, with the woman's body, in this case, projected through the masquerade as literally carrying the weight of the sociopolitics of its time. I think that is where we will find that, Annalee will appreciate the use of this word, we'll find that access. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Quincy. Amanda, thank you so much, first of all, for being here with us. Oh my God. I could just hear you, like, listen to you talk for hours. I don't know how to formulate this question properly. I've been trying for a while now. But what I find so fascinating about your work and your practice is that you combine the street with the academic institute. And I think my biggest question within that is, how do you individually, so this is a quite personal question, but how do you individually reconcile those two universes when they are so related but also so unrelated? You know, there's sometimes questions about, should we bring what is ours of the street into the academic walls to be studied? Mm-hmm. And how do you then relate those two to each other? Thank you.
That's a really great question. Thank you very much. And I think many practitioners, especially masquerade practitioners, who may not have come out of academics, have a hesitation towards academic life, have a suspicion of researchers having lost so much over the years in terms of their intellectual property after having given access to researchers, etc. And so there is a suspicion, one, of research, and there's also a feeling of exclusion from academia. But thankfully, once I decided to return to postgraduate work, there was also already a space created for exactly what I was doing. There were already various bodies of scholarship that had been sustained through many years and developed concerning practice-based research. So when I returned, I was able to apply for a program that facilitated that. And I was happy to learn that in addition to the wide range of critical theory that I could investigate, that the questions I would develop, the research questions I develop, would be research questions that emerge from my practice and would not be imposed on my practice. And I thought that was the most respectful as well as productive approach for me. And I still struggle with academic language. I've been told, and I continue to hear myself sometimes sound very, very academic. And in some circles, that's cool. I mean, listen, I'm among my academic peers here, I'm sure, with all my buddies from the Nieuwe Instituut, etc. But I have had to, and I'm glad for this, develop a spectrum of presentation, like always considering the audience to which I will be presenting this work. Because on a daily basis, there are people in my various social media inboxes who are practitioners in Carnival who are not necessarily interested in listening to a lecture such as what was presented, but they are deeply interested in and would support my work and would stand up for it and would defend it and would make the strongest cases of advocacy for it. And so even with the burgeoning academic and intellectual pursuits, I continue to remember that this entire investigation of Carnival studies exists only because these practitioners exist and they continue to do their work. And one of the great failings in the ways in which researchers have approached Carnival is the ways in which items are selected for further investigation. Every year on the road, at Carnival time, I see things that I consider to be brilliant works of art that would fade into obscurity because nobody takes any interest in it unless it's a researcher or a journalist or an artist who has a project specifically related to that theme that may be represented in that work. It's going to unfortunately be lost. And so the question of archiving, which was one of the questions of this fellowship, and how do we archive and sustainably archive contemporary Caribbean masquerade practices, is one of those things that's constantly on my mind. And I hope that through my continued practice and respecting the practice by allowing research questions to emerge from it and to give the space for those questions to breed within an academic practice, would somehow find answers or directions towards possible answers to that question. You're welcome.
I want to say also that it wasn't a critique.
No.
Because I appreciate the fact that you move between the worlds. You know, when we're talking about access, it's literally the embodiment of you don't have to be one thing. You can be all of the things all at once. They can coexist all at once. And yeah, I just want to express my appreciation for you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I like how you say you could be all the things all at once. I know there are many Caribbean people on the live stream, and that's one thing that's always been said about us in the Caribbean. Like, you have to, of necessity, be so many things all at once. It's like you have to become all things unto all people as a way of survival, of making a way in the world. It's the Caribbean and the world. And this was expressed quite elegantly by the now deceased Professor Emeritus Gordon Roller in his beautiful essay called The Problem of Form, in which he talks about the multi-hyphenated Caribbean. So you're the artist and the scholar and the writer and the painter and the cook and the bottle washer. And you're everything, and you have to be.
I'm looking around. Last question is in the back. Unless there's another question.
Federica.
One more question.
You will ask.
Hi, good evening. Hi,
Hello.
Amanda. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again.
Thank you so much for everything that you shared today. And also, Annalee, thank you so much. Hi. I wanted to share an observation that I just had, because coming here and seeing your practice and hearing about your practice, it's so uniquely yours, but also it's like its own entity almost, as I experience it. And all of a sudden I had the realization of a reference to the Aruban Carnival, at least me experiencing it there, growing up there. In Juvip Morning you have like the element of baby doll as well, but in a very almost raw way where people dress up as a girl, men and women, everybody. And yeah, I found it very beautiful all of a sudden, like this this clash of, oh yeah, we also practice baby doll here. I don't know if you've heard about it, but it's almost like either dressing up as a girl or even a baby. Like people wear diapers and walk around with the chupong, like the, how do you say it? The pacifier. So yeah, I all of a sudden was like, oh my God, it's going all around. It's beautiful. I don't know if you've also experienced this in your research, if you've come across it, but I was curious to know.
No, to be thankful, first of all. This is the first time I'm hearing about it, so thank you for introducing me to that, and I will definitely look further into it, of course. And this so beautifully goes back to our conversation concerning Caribbean migrations. That, I mean, it is the poet Martin Carter who said, I'm going to misquote him, but he says, the only thing that really separates us in the Caribbean is the sea. That we have been constantly moving through and through these islands since the time the the first indigenous person left the continent and start making their way up the archipelago, and then with various continental interests in the Caribbean for various reasons, and we can take a pause to reflect on that history of violence, but more than that, to joyfully and hopefully reflect on the history of exchange, an exchange that made us not so much aware of our differences, but even more aware of how very familiar we are with each other. So I'm thankful that a person from Aruba with a practice that I didn't, in a place with a practice of baby doll that I didn't know about, could recognize it in this presentation today. And I mean, it's just, again, a testimony to Caribbean migrations.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And with that...
Yeah, I have one more, not a question, but a comment left by last year's Tilting Axis Fellow, Cleon John. He's in the chat, and he says, "Great talk, Amanda. Our Caribbean history and heritage are so rich that the work of archiving and analysis can feel overwhelming and exciting at the same time. It shouldn't just be the work of artists and historians, but it should become ubiquitous to our whole culture, so more of this, please."
Wonderful. Thank you, Cleon.
I was like, I'm just gonna sit today and not be part of it, and I'm like the triangulation here, but hi Cleon, I think you can hear me but not see me. But last year Cleon, just a year ago, was I was moderating also a talk with him, and he was talking about how the ocean actually separates the Caribbean and how difficult it is to have intercontinental travel. So I don't know, I just had a little moment of flashback to his practice and connecting also to your final comment on synergies within the Caribbean and its histories.
Wonderful, thank you. I think there's a way in which tonight in this conversation was a lot, and we want more. And yet at the same time, we have technicians and we have all these other people working and doing things, and they have contracts for a certain amount of hours. And so I want to thank you, Amanda, for sharing so much with us, for sharing your work, for sharing your insights, your research, your practice. It's truly amazing. And I think Nieuwe Instituut, Tilting Axis, we're all the richer for knowing you and your practice.
Thank you so much, Quincy. And thanks to all of you for joining me this evening. This was really, really wonderful and heartfelt. And I look forward to talking to you even after the program is done. Thank you, Dan. Yes.
Thank you, Annalee.
That was great.
I'll go cross any ocean to find it. Won't let no mountain get in the way. Hey. Come cross the water, been through the fire. I know that my heart will show many ways. Everywhere you turn, you see people smiling. We don't see no creed and race. Don't want nobody tell we about leaving. We fight for we thing and this is we place. Take me home.